Two Forks Tower. Two Forks Tower, this is Thoroughfare Tower. Come in.
Hello? Whoever this is?
It's Henry, right?
Yeah.
I'm Delilah.
Yeah, that's what the guy said on the phone.
So, what's wrong with you?
Excuse me?
People take this job to get away from something. So what's wrong?
What's wrong with you?
That's a great idea. Go ahead.
Look, I just hiked for 2 days, so I don't really follow whatever it is you're doing right now.
You take a stab at what's wrong with me.
Fine, then can I sleep forever?
Sure, buddy. Okay, now go ahead.
Okay, you've killed 3 husbands. You're a black widow and you're just out here until the heat dies down and then you'll kill again.
Ooh, very good. Bravo, Henry.
Okay, I sleep now?
Not quite. Now you.
Okay, good night, bye.
Let's see. I don't know anything about you. I say you got fired from your job and have finally decided to write your novel. That's the sort of bullshit reason you'll find a man out in the woods.
Good night.
Welcome to the job.
So begins Firewatch, a mystery-driven fire lookout simulator from indie game studio Campo Santo. You play as Henry, a middle-aged man from Boulder, Colorado, who has taken a summer job as a fire lookout in Wyoming's Shoshone National Forest. You've probably heard of Firewatch. You may have even played it. If so, you probably know that you spend around 5 minutes of the game's 5-hour runtime sitting peacefully in your lookout tower and watching for smoke. I played Firewatch for the first time in early 2023. More recently, after reading a few books about fire, I decided to give it another go. But this time, I was going in with a modus operandi. My memories of Firewatch centered on the game's stunning graphics, intriguing mystery, witty character interactions, and, of course, its tragic ending, which haunted me for days afterwards. You might have noticed that nothing on that list pertains to fire, which is exactly what prompted me to replay the game. In Firewatch, fires plural shape the plot and the player experience, but the story of fire in the game remained elusive when I tried to recall it. So I re-downloaded the game, determined to explore the fire narrative of Firewatch. Since I'd already completed the game once, I was able to play it with the audio tour this time around, which I highly recommend because it added so much to the experience and it gave me some great insight into the development process. And now you're all caught up. Alright, let's get into it. One of the most echoed praises for Firewatch is for its beautiful, immersive environment. It's set in the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming, and while you traverse the game's wooded trails into sun-dappled meadows and magnificent canyons, you really do feel like you're walking through a national park. More than just the graphics, the game's creative soundscape, which is mostly composed of ambient nature sounds like wind, bird calls, and the crunch of dirt and gravel under your feet, creates a captivating atmosphere. Most sounds were recorded specifically for the game by the devs themselves, who hiked through Yosemite National Park and other protected areas to get a feel for the setting. What's any of this got to do with fire? Well, for starters, evidence of fire, and foreshadowing of fires to come, is all over the landscape. There's a big burned-out section of forest out by Mule Point, and there's a smaller one down by Ruby River from a more recent controlled burn. What's really cool is how the two sites differ. The first one is undergoing what forest scientists call secondary succession, which is the growth of new plant life after a fire or other environmental disturbance, while the second one is just charred earth, which makes sense given how very recent the burn there was. Here's game designer Nels Anderson discussing the rationale behind the riverside location of the controlled burn, which is informed by real fire science.
So, in the case in the game right here, the idea is that the firefighter crew burned out all the fuel right next to the river so that the fire couldn't be blown basically across the river, that the hope is between the controlled burn and the river itself, the fire wouldn't actually spread all the way up to Two Forks and beyond. As you will discover later in the game, they did not succeed at that.
And then you get to day 64, when the June fire starts up. As the fire gets bigger, the in-game environment changes to reflect its proximity and severity. From day 64 on, a haze hangs over the Shoshone, getting thicker with each passing day. By day 79, the last day in the game, you can barely see 10 feet ahead through the smoke, as sparks fly in all directions, and the whirring of a water bomber is the only sound loud enough to cut through the wind. Here's devs Chris Remo and Ollie Moss discussing the process for creating Day 79.
Yeah, it was really important that the end of the game felt very sort of climactic and exciting, and for the style of this, we actually looked at first-person views of like real forest fighting that had been recorded in Australia, and it was so intense, and the thought of like trying to hit that, like the benchmark had been set, right? So we had to try and get something that captured that feeling. I think we were all surprised by how close it got in the end.
Something else I noticed this time around, now that I was playing with fire top of mind, are all of the clues embedded in the landscape that foreshadowed the June fire. As you explore the forest from day to day, you might notice the abundance of surface fuels, or all the stuff on the forest floor that could fuel a fire. Leaves are carried through the air by strong winds, there's fallen branches and logs and meadows full of dry, crunchy grass. The developers did a great deal of research on all things fire to create an in-game setting that accurately reflected the time and place in which the game is set. 1989 in the Shoshone National Forest. One of those things is advertising. Throughout the game, you encounter several posters, pinned up in your fire tower and tacked to various cache boxes, which the devs have explained are designed in the style of 1980s fire prevention ads. Firewatch even has its own Smokey Bear-esque mascot named Forrest Burns.
I don't think there's any fictional character I hate more than Forrest Burns.
Henry, as an employee of the Forest Service, that is treason.
Yeah, well, he really freaked me out as a kid.
He inspired me to spend the bulk of my 30s keeping the wilderness safe.
A shrink would have a field day with you.
Thanks, Mom.
Where the research done by the developers really shows, though, is in the design of the fire towers and the depiction of fire lookout work. Henry's fire tower, Two Forks Tower, is as accurate as it could be given the constraints of game design. When you look at pictures from the 80s and 90s of fire towers in the US, you can see that they nailed it. This is, in part, because they did a lot of field research for the game. Here's game designer Nels Anderson and environmental artist Jane Ng sharing a bit of their process.
So you're likely standing at the base of your home away from home, your home in the wilderness. For all intents and purposes, more or less, this is basically just a real straight-up tower like they existed out in the woods, right?
Yeah, I think it is Portland. There's somebody in Portland who was very good about archiving a lot of blueprints about various type of fire lookouts of the state, and we got some, and that's how we started off building the Firewatch. The lookout tower, just by looking through how they were actually built.
Henry's time as a fire lookout is a bit more exciting than the job is in real life, but the devs managed to make it feel fairly realistic by consulting with former lookout workers. Here's game designer Nels Anderson and writer Sean Vanneman on what they found out.
I called up the Ministry of Forests and Natural Resources here in British Columbia and got redirected to like 3 increasingly small Ministry of Forest offices until someone just gave me literally the phone number of this cool old lady who had once been a fire lookout. So I just kind of chatted with her for like an hour and a half just about what doing the job was like.
The main takeaway from whenever we would talk to someone who had done this job is, why would you make a game about that? That is the most boring time of my entire life.
It's worth noting that the boring parts in Firewatch are cut out for the sake of the story, as most of Henry's 79 days in the Shoshone are skipped over, with only around 10 playable days in the game. Of course, the devs also brought fire history into their game by virtue of its setting. The Shoshone National Forest and Yellowstone National Park border one another, so the famous Yellowstone fires of 1988 affected both areas. And actually, Firewatch is set about a year after the 1988 fires, which is pretty significant. So, naturally, I was watching and waiting for a Yellowstone reference, and I wasn't disappointed.
So are you going to let me know what happened that caused this budget increase or what?
Wow. I can't believe you don't know.
I was a little preoccupied last summer.
Jeez. I mean, the federal government almost let Yellowstone National Park burn to the ground? Ring a bell?
Yellowstone is like, what, 15 miles away? Why would they do that?
Well, the short story is that for 60 years, we got very good at not letting forest fires happen. And then about 15 years ago, they decided that forest fires in wilderness areas like Yellowstone should be left to burn. So that's what they did. I can't believe you didn't hear about this. There were reports that the entire park was gone. Dan Rather telling the country that President Reagan didn't care on the nightly news. I mean, what the hell's he gonna do? Smoke jump in and snuff one out for the Gipper?
So what should they have done?
I don't even know. By the time the Yellowstone folks realized the little fires weren't gonna burn themselves out, 100,000 acres were gone. It's Yellowstone, you know? People don't want to touch it. But we touch it every single day. But hey, I got a 30 cents an hour raise because we can't have another fiasco. Like the goddamn park can burn down again.
Another thing, and I'm not sure if this was intentional, but the way that the June fire was handled, or rather, not handled, really speaks to the U.S. Forest Service's response to the Yellowstone fires. Ed Struzik gets into this a bit in his book, Dark Days at Noon, but there was a real reluctance on the part of the Forest Service to keep on burning after Yellowstone, even with fire signs backing them up. So the number of controlled burns took a nosedive for a couple years, until another big blaze happened in 1994. This would explain why the only controlled burn you encounter in the game is that small section by the river, which was clearly not enough to stop the June fire. Campo Santo did an excellent job embedding fire into the in-game environment, drawing from historical fire events and practices to achieve an impressively realistic setting. But what role exactly does fire play in Firewatch? How does it figure into the game's plot? What narrative function does it perform? On Campo Santo's website for the game, Firewatch is described as a mystery set in the Wyoming wilderness, where your only emotional lifeline is the person on the other end of a handheld radio. Building a relationship with the person in question, your supervisor, Delilah, and investigating the mystery together makes up the main plot of Firewatch. At the start of this video, I played a clip from the beginning of Firewatch. Only, I lied. This clip is not actually the game's opening scene. Instead, Firewatch opens with a choose-your-own-adventure style segment, which reveals its main subplot, Henry's relationship with his wife, Julia, who we learn has been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. As her condition deteriorates, Henry sees a newspaper ad for a fire lookout job and takes the opportunity to escape from his tragic circumstances into the wilderness. When reflecting on my first playthrough, I couldn't help but think that fire itself was reduced to nothing more than a plot device that advances the main plot and subplot. This interpretation was informed by moments like this one, where the June fire becomes a jumping-off point for a personal conversation between Henry and Delilah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're here.
Sure you are.
I am.
I don't know what that means.
It doesn't matter, I get it. With Julie and everything, you probably don't want to be here.
After my second playthrough, though, I've got a different understanding of the game's fire narrative. Through its central mystery, Firewatch builds suspense and creates unease. As Henry discovers increasingly weird things, the mess left by someone who ransacked his lookout tower, a clipboard with transcripts of his and Delilah's private conversations, a fenced-off Area 51 with strange high-tech equipment, he and Delilah come to suspect that some kind of evil scheme is at play, that someone is tracking and blackmailing them. Of course, the isolation that comes with being a fire lookout in the remote wilderness of a national forest doesn't help their paranoia. Convinced it has something to do with the locked cave that he discovered on day one, Henry finds his way inside and discovers the dead body of Brian Goodwin, young son of former lookout Ned Goodwin. The next day, an evacuation order is issued for all lookouts in the area of the June fire, which has joined up with another human-caused fire and is now officially out of control. You spend your last day as Henry hiking up to the evacuation point, and along the way, you find a tape with your name on it. Upon listening, you learn that Ned has been hiding in the Shoshone for the past 3 years after failing to prevent his son's death, and that he was surveilling Henry and Delilah for his own peace of mind. Just like that, the suspected government psyop is revealed to be nothing more than the desperate antics of a grieving father. It's not hard to see the parallels between Brian's death and the June fire, which continues raging on around you as you process what you've heard on the tape, especially not when you have some knowledge of fire history. Until the early 1970s, wildfire policy in Canada and the US was defined by media campaigns and fire management practices that focused on suppressing fire. It took decades upon decades of wildfires that increased in intensity even as they sometimes dropped in number for the US Forest Service to accept that fire is a natural phenomenon, not some secret force out to get you, and certainly not something you can always control. Similarly, when you get to the end of Firewatch, Henry, and the player, now has to accept that there was no wacky government plot, just death and the things grief does to the people left behind. The connection between fire and the Julia subplot is perhaps even clearer. At its inception on Day 64, the June fire is not yet too concerning, especially what with the recent controlled burn done down by the river. Over time, the fire slowly increases in size and threat level until it becomes too big to ignore, and Henry must evacuate alongside the other lookouts. Henry leaves for Two Forks to escape from the pain of losing the love of his life to a degenerative disease. Throughout his time there, Delilah pokes and prods at him, trying to get him to open up and process his emotions with little success. Come evacuation day, Henry has no choice but to face his problems head-on and go see Julia again. This next part might sound like a bit of a stretch, but just hear me out. The Julia subplot is also linked to fire in another way. Henry's suppression of his own emotions can be likened to the fire suppression approach that defined Western wildfire management from the late 1800s through most of the 20th century. Fire suppression was informed by the misguided belief that preventing fires altogether, even small wildfires in mild conditions, was both possible and healthy for ecosystems. With hindsight, it's a bit easier to see the fault in logic. We now have a better understanding that the more fire is suppressed in an ecosystem, the bigger the next blaze will be. But it wasn't until 1972 that the US Forest Service came around to the idea of just letting fires burn to regenerate ecosystems and reduce the risk of massive wildfires. My point here is that, ultimately, fire management officials realized that the only surefire way to mitigate wildfire was to let it happen sometimes. Okay, come on. I went this whole time without making a fire pun. It had to happen at some point. At the end of Firewatch, Henry has to face the music in the same way. Running away from his situation and stamping his feelings out every time they flare up just isn't working. In this way, the fire narrative of Firewatch underscores what might be considered the game's key takeaway. No matter what, you've got to face reality eventually, and, as Delilah says in the game's final scene, to find a way to contain the damage. And then, of course, there's the story of the player. In this case, me, but what I mean isn't my personal journey with the game. More how the game itself works to evoke feelings about fire from its players. When you play Firewatch, you spend somewhere between 3 and 10 hours, depending on how thorough you are and how often you get lost, exploring the Shoshone as Henry. You spend hours traversing the in-game environment, getting to know your way to and from your tower, seeing sights that are breathtaking, even in a video game. And then, Day 79 comes around, and you have to watch it all go up in flames. It's hard to watch, even when you remember, as Ed Struzek does in Dark Days, that the Yellowstone fires were ultimately more rejuvenative than they were destructive for the landscape, and that the same can likely be said for the June fire. It's still an emotional experience. In their book on affective eco-criticism, Kyle Blado and Jennifer Ladino described the concept of affect, which is basically an intense emotion that comes to life in your body that you can't really put a name to. They claim that we always have an affective response to climate change and natural disasters. And I think that's pretty much what's going on at the end of Firewatch. The June fire demands an affective response of some kind from players. I've seen a lot of online discourse about the game's ending. A lot of people saying that they weren't fully satisfied and that it felt really abrupt, which of course it's going to feel that way by design, because a wildfire can get scary big in no time flat, but even reflecting on my own experience the first time around, I remember that I couldn't really put into words what I was feeling when the credits rolled. I just felt something. Something big enough to make me go, wow, great game, but I never want to play that again. And to me, that also speaks to the narrative power fire has in this game. So, is Firewatch a game about fire? Yes, and no. Ultimately, Firewatch itself isn't about fire so much as fire is just one of multiple narrative threads that Camposanto has weaved into a really fascinating, devastating narrative tapestry. I went into this playthrough almost a little skeptical, not really sure how much I'd find, especially narratively, about fire in Firewatch. What I will say is that I was pleasantly surprised to return to this game that I thought didn't actually have too much to do with fire, and find fire in all sorts of ways, everywhere I looked. If you liked this video, or if you hated it, and especially if you saw something that I missed, let me know in the comments. And please also check out the description for a short bibliography of the awesome books and sites and photos that taught me everything I needed to know to make this video, and then some. Thank you so much for watching.